Millions of dollars sat on the mahogany table, a twisted game proposed by a billionaire who claimed nothing could break him. He smirked, mocking the desperate waitstaff. But he didn't know the quiet woman pouring his wine held the one terrifying secret that would destroy his entire empire tonight. Cigar smoke hung thick and heavy beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Wellington Club, Chicago's most exclusive underground dining society. At the center of the VIP enclave, surrounded by empty bottles of Chateau Margaux and half-eaten plates of Wagyu, sat Dakota Harrington. At 42, Dakota was the undisputed king of Harrington Capital, a predatory hedge fund known for gutting Midwestern manufacturing companies and leaving thousands jobless. Tonight he was celebrating his latest kill, the hostile takeover and subsequent liquidation of a century-old pharmaceutical supplier. Dakota leaned back against the plush velvet booth, loosening his silk Stefano Ricci tie. His eyes, a pale and piercing shade of blue, scanned the sycophants, laughing too loudly at his jokes. To his left was Oliver Trent, a senior partner at Kirkland, and Ellis, who specialized in making Dakota's legal headaches disappear. To his right sat his chief financial officer, a nervous, sweating man named Gregory Miller, who looked like he was one bad quarter away from a heart attack. But Dakota wasn't interested in his colleagues. He was bored. The thrill of the multi-million-dollar acquisition had already faded, replaced by the hollow, gnawing apathy that always followed his victories. He craved entertainment. He craved control. He snapped his fingers. Instantly, the maitre d' materialized from the shadows, bowing slightly. "More wine, Mr. Harrington." "No." Dakota said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that demanded absolute silence. The laughter at the table died instantly. Dakota reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke suit and pulled out a leather checkbook. He unscrewed a Montblanc fountain pen and began writing. The scratching of the nib against the thick paper was the only sound in the room. With a theatrical flick of his wrist, he tore the check free and slapped it face up onto the center of the table. Gregory leaned in, his eyes widening behind his wire-rimmed glasses. $5 million. The payee line was blank. "I am a man who feels nothing," Dakota announced, resting his elbows on the table and tenting his fingers. "Joy, sorrow, pity, they are useless metrics, weaknesses for the poor. I haven't shed a tear since I was 7 years old, and my father beat me for crying over a broken toy. So let's play a game." He looked past his executives to the row of impeccably dressed waitstaff standing at attention near the mahogany-paneled walls. $5 million, Dakota declared, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "To anyone in this room, waiter, busboy, chef, who can tell me a story, state a fact, or say a single sentence that makes me cry. Right here, right now. You make a single tear fall from these eyes, you walk out of here a multi-millionaire. You fail and you are fired on the spot. I've already bought the manager. Your jobs are mine to terminate." A tense, suffocating silence fell over the room. $5 million. It was enough to change generations. It was a sum that could pay off medical debts, buy houses, save lives. A young busboy named Kevin was the first to break. Trembling, he stepped forward, twisting his white apron in his hands. "Sir, my mother. She's at Mount Sinai right now. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The insurance company denied her experimental treatment yesterday. I work 3 jobs to try and afford it, but she only has weeks left. She held my hand this morning and told me she was sorry for being a burden." Kevin's voice broke, tears streaming down his own face. Dakota stared at the boy. His expression didn't shift. The corners of his mouth twitched upward into a cold, reptilian smirk. "People die every day," Kevin thought. Dakota said softly, "Usually because they can't afford to live. It's the basic principle of economics. Your mother's cellular mutation is not my emotional responsibility. You failed. Clear out your locker." Kevin sobbed, devastatingly crushed, and was swiftly escorted out by security. Next came an older waitress who recounted a horrific house fire that took her 2 children. Then a sommelier who spoke of his brother's suicide after returning from a brutal combat tour. Through it all, Dakota sat like a stone gargoyle, sipping his sparkling water, his smirk only growing wider. The trauma of the working class was nothing more than a late-night comedy special to him. "Pathetic," Dakota scoffed, picking up the check and waving it in the air. "Is this the best the Wellington Club has to offer? A parade of sob stories. Tragedy is cheap. Try harder." Standing in the darkest corner of the dining room, holding a silver tray tightly against her hip, was Madeline Hayes. Madeline was 31, with sharp features, tired eyes, and a mind like a steel trap. She had been working at the Wellington Club for exactly 1 year, 4 months, and 12 days. She had not applied for the job because of the tips nor the prestige. She had applied because Dakota Harrington dined at table 4 every 3rd Friday of the month without fail. She had watched him ruin lives from afar. She had watched him laugh at the misery of others. She had spent 5 years tracking his every move, digging through encrypted servers, bribing disgruntled former private investigators, and piecing together the fragments of a night the world had been paid to forget. Madeline took a deep, steadying breath. Her heart wasn't racing. It was cold. Absolute, freezing cold. She stepped out of the shadows. Her black heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The executives at the table turned to look at her. Oliver Trent let out a dismissive scoff. "Another peasant with a dying dog," Oliver sneered. Madeline ignored the lawyer. She walked straight to the edge of the table and stopped directly across from Dakota. She didn't look at the check. She looked straight into the pale, dead eyes of the billionaire. "I don't have a sad story, Mr. Harrington," Madeline said. Her voice was steady, perfectly modulated, carrying no trace of the nervous tremor that had doomed the others. Dakota raised an eyebrow, amused by her composure. "Then what do you have, sweetheart, a joke? Because if you think you can make me laugh so hard I cry, you are sorely mistaken." "I have a memory," Madeline said smoothly. "Yours." Dakota chuckled, leaning forward. "My memory, I think you'll find my memories are quite pleasant, filled with yachts in Monaco and the screams of my competitors. But go on. You have 2 minutes before I have security throw you out onto the pavement." Madeline didn't flinch. Slowly she reached into the deep pocket of her black uniform apron. She didn't pull out a photograph or a weapon or a legal document. She pulled out a heavily tarnished dented silver Zippo lighter and a braided leather bracelet, the kind a child might weave at summer camp. The leather was deeply stained with a dark, rusted brown color. Dried blood. She placed them carefully on the pristine white tablecloth right next to the $5 million check. The moment the polished silver of the lighter hit the fabric, Dakota's smirk froze. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to drop away. His pale blue eyes locked onto the dented corner of the lighter. A lighter with custom engraving, "To NH, burn the world." Love, Jay. October 14th, 2018. Madeline began her voice, ringing out with forensic precision. Montauk Highway, 2:14 a.m. It was raining heavily. You were driving a 2017 Aston Martin DB11 charcoal grey. You had consumed 4 glasses of Macallan 25 at a private party in East Hampton. You were arguing loudly with the passenger. Gregory Miller, the CFO, frowned. "What is this, stop her, Nate? This is inappropriate." Dakota didn't speak. He didn't blink. The blood was rapidly draining from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. He was staring at the braided bracelet. The passenger. Madeline continued, taking a slow step to her left, circling the table like a predator, sizing up wounded prey. Was Josephine Miller. No relation to your CFO here. Of course. She was 26. A brilliant junior analyst at your old firm. And according to the secret ultrasound tucked in her Prada purse, that night, she was 10 weeks pregnant with your child. Oliver Trent slammed his hand on the table. Security. Get this lunatic out of here. That's slander. Shut up, Oliver, Dakota croaked. It was the first time his voice had sounded anything less than perfectly controlled. It was a raspy, hollow sound. You were arguing, Madeline said, her eyes never leaving Dakota's face, because Josephine had found the offshore ledgers, the ones proving you embezzled $30 million from your mentor's pension fund to cover your early disastrous margin calls. She told you she was going to the SEC on Monday. She told you she wouldn't let her child be raised by a thief. Madeline stopped pacing. She leaned over the table, bringing her face inches from Dakota's. At 2:16 a.m., doing 85 miles an hour around a blind curve, you unbuckled her seatbelt. You reached over, grabbed the steering wheel, and intentionally jerked it to the right. Gasps erupted from the executives. Oliver Trent looked like he had been struck by lightning. He knew Dakota was ruthless, but this, the Aston Martin hydroplaned. Madeline narrated, painting the horrific picture with cold, clinical strokes. It smashed through the guardrail and rolled 3 times down the embankment into a cluster of oak trees. The passenger side took the brunt of the impact. The engine caught fire. Dakota's breathing was erratic now. His chest heaved. He reached a trembling hand toward his collar, pulling at his tie, as if all the oxygen had suddenly been sucked from the room. You miraculously survived with only a broken collarbone and a concussion thanks to the driver's side airbags, Madeline said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. But Josephine was trapped. Her legs were crushed under the dashboard. She was bleeding out, screaming for you to help her. Stop, Dakota whispered. The word barely made it past his lips. You didn't pull her out, Madeline said, ignoring him. You crawled out of the wreckage. You stood in the rain, watching the flames inch closer to the cabin. And you reached into the car, not to save her, but to grab this. Madeline tapped the dented Zippo lighter. You lit a cigarette, and you watched her burn. You stood there for 14 minutes, watching the mother of your unborn child burn alive, ensuring the only witness to your fraud was turned to ash. How? Dakota gasped, terror completely overriding his aristocratic features. How could you possibly know that the police? Chief Mitchell ruled it an accident. The car caught fire. I tried to save her. I told them I tried. Chief Mitchell got a wire transfer of $500,000 3 days later through a shell corporation in the Caymans, Madeline countered smoothly. But Mitchell wasn't the problem. Was he Dakota? The problem was the Gibson Dunn fixer you hired to scrub the wreckage. He missed something. Madeline pointed to the blood-stained braided leather bracelet. Josephine's little sister made that for her. Josephine never took it off. She was wearing it when you left her to die. And while you were standing in the rain, smoking your cigarette, waiting for her screams to stop you, didn't realize that Josephine's phone was still connected to the car's Bluetooth system. Dakota's eyes widened to the size of saucers. A violent shudder ripped through his body. She had pocket-dialed someone during the crash. Madeline said, her voice, finally breaking its clinical rhythm, laced now with an ocean of suppressed rage. She called her sister. The call went to voicemail. 3 minutes and 42 seconds of audio. I heard the crash. I heard her begging you. I heard you tell her, "It's better this way, Josie. The fire will hide the audit trail." Dakota let out a guttural sound, something between a choke and a whimper. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "I am Josephine's sister," Madeline said, pulling a sleek black flash drive from her apron and tossing it onto the check. "And this drive doesn't just hold the audio recording. It holds the financial ledgers Josephine emailed to a dead-drop server 10 minutes before getting into your car. It holds the bank statements tying you to Chief Mitchell's bribe. It holds everything." Dakota stared at the flash drive like it was a live grenade. The billionaire, the untouchable titan of industry, began to shake violently. You can't!" Dakota stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing the exits were suddenly blocked by several large men in dark suits, men who did not work for the Wellington Club, but for the FBI. Madeline had tipped them off. This wasn't a dinner shift. It was a raid. "Look closely at the lighter, Dakota," Madeline ordered. Dakota hands, trembling uncontrollably, looked down. Beneath the engraving, "To NH, burn the world. Love, Jay." A tiny blinking red light was embedded in the hinge. "It's a microphone," Madeline stated, stepping back. "I just broadcast this entire conversation, including your admission of being present at the crash and mentioning Chief Mitchell to the United States Attorney's Office. They are waiting for you outside." The absolute reality of his destruction crashed down upon Dakota Harrington. His empire, his freedom, his pristine reputation annihilated in less than 3 minutes by a waitress he had intended to humiliate. The walls were closing in. He pictured the inside of a federal penitentiary. He pictured the loss of his wealth. The sheer, suffocating terror of his inevitable ruin shattered the psychological dam he had built since he was 7 years old. A single heavy drop of water spilled over his lower eyelid. The tear traced a jagged path down his pale cheek, splashing onto the $5 million check, smudging the fresh black ink. He collapsed back into the booth, burying his face in his hands, unleashing a raw, pathetic sob that echoed through the dead, silent dining room. Madeline stood tall, watching the broken man weep. She calmly reached down, picked up the tear-stained check, folded it in half, and slipped it into her apron. "Thank you for the tip, Mr. Harrington," she said quietly. "Keep the change." Conclusion and call to action. The arrogance of power is blinding, but the shadows of the past never truly forget. Madeline didn't just break a billionaire. She dismantled an empire with nothing but the truth and a $5 million tear. The mighty always fall when their foundations are built on lies. If you loved this jaw-dropping story of revenge and justice, hit that like button, share this with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramatic tales. Red and blue emergency lights fractured the oppressive darkness outside the Wellington Club, painting the wet Chicago pavement in violent strokes of neon. Inside the velvet-lined walls, the suffocating arrogance that had long defined Dakota Harrington was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, shivering wreck of a man. Federal agents clad in tactical windbreakers swarmed the dining room, their heavy boots trampling the imported Persian rugs. Oliver Trent, the high-powered attorney who had spent a decade burying Dakota's sins, backed away from the table, his hands raised in a desperate pantomime of surrender. He knocked over a crystal decanter of wine, the dark red liquid spilling across the floor like fresh blood. "I had no knowledge of this," Oliver stammered, his polished veneer cracking as 2 agents flanked him. "I am simply his retained counsel for corporate matters. I invoke my right to remain silent." Madeline Hayes stood perfectly still, watching the chaos unfold with the detached precision of a surgeon who had just successfully excised a malignant tumor. She adjusted the strap of her black apron, the $5 million check resting safely against her hip. Dakota was hauled to his feet. The custom tailoring of his Stefano Ricci suit suddenly looked absurd, hanging off his trembling frame as heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted around his wrists. The metallic clicks echoed sharply through the room, a brutal counterpoint to the soft jazz that was still playing faintly over the restaurant's audio system. "You have the right to remain silent," Special Agent Harrison barked, gripping Dakota's bicep with unforgiving force. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Dakota didn't fight. He couldn't. The psychological collapse was total. He was dragged past the line of terrified waitstaff, past the half-eaten Wagyu beef, and out through the heavy mahogany doors. The cold November wind hit him like a physical blow as he was shoved into the back of a black armored SUV. As the door slammed shut, severing him from the world he had once ruled, the gravity of his situation settled over him like a lead shroud. By dawn, the financial world was in flames. The flash drive Madeline had surrendered to the United States Attorney's Office proved to be a Pandora's box of catastrophic proportions. It did not merely contain the audio recording of Josephine's murder. It held a meticulously organized labyrinth of offshore accounts, forged audit reports, and wire transfers linking Harrington Capital to a vast syndicate of bribery and market manipulation. News networks abandoned their regular programming, splashing Dakota's mugshot across screens from Tokyo to London. The hedge fund stock plummeted to zero within the first 10 minutes of trading, wiping billions of dollars of illicit wealth from the global markets. Deep inside the Dirksen Federal Building, Dakota sat in a windowless interrogation room, staring blankly at the scarred metal table. He had been stripped of his silk tie and shoelaces. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly overhead, offering no warmth. When the heavy steel door finally opened, it was not his lawyer who entered, but Madeline. She was no longer wearing the uniform of a waitress. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and carried a thick manila folder, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying authority. Agent Harrison stood by the door, granting her a grim nod. "What do you want?" Dakota rasped, his throat raw from hours of silent panic. "You won. You destroyed everything. Are you here to gloat?" Madeline sat across from him, opening the folder. "I am not here to gloat, Dakota. I am here to ensure that you understand the exact dimensions of your cage. You see, during your little panic attack last night, your brain was too overloaded to process the logistics of what I actually did." She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a bank statement. "The check you wrote me," Madeline explained softly. $5 million. It was drawn from your personal contingency account at Geneva Trust. Do you know what happened at exactly 8:15 this morning, 30 seconds before the federal judge signed the global freeze on all your assets? Dakota stared at her, his blood running cold. "No." "The check cleared," Madeline stated, leaning back in her hard plastic chair. "I had a team of forensic accountants waiting on standby. The moment I walked out of that club, I initiated an expedited wire transfer through a secure channel. By the time the feds locked down your empire, those $5 million were already gone." Dakota let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "So you're a thief now, too? Congratulations. You ruined me just to make yourself rich. You are no better than I am, Madeline." "Oh, I didn't keep a single cent for myself," she replied, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "That would be blood money. I wouldn't touch it. I deposited it into an irrevocable trust fund." She slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was a list of names. Over 300 of them. "That is the roster of the factory workers you unlawfully terminated when you gutted Apex Manufacturing in Ohio last year," Madeline said. "The ones whose pensions you illegally liquidated to finance your summer home in Lake Como. The $5 million was distributed equally among them this morning. You didn't just pay me to cry, Dakota. You funded the survival of the very people you tried to destroy. Dakota stared at the list, the reality of his utter impotence finally taking root. He had not just been outplayed. He had been dismantled, his own weapon turned against him with devastating precision. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing for the darkness to swallow him whole, but there was no escape. The ghost of Montauk Highway had not only returned to haunt him, she had returned to rip his world apart, piece by piece. 6 months later, the spectacle of the trial captivated the nation. It was branded the trial of the century, a brutal dissection of Wall Street greed, intersecting with ruthless corporate murder. The courtroom was packed every single day, a sea of journalists, former employees, and curious onlookers hungry to see the fallen titan face his reckoning. Dakota had lost 30 pounds. His once immaculate hair was thinning and heavily streaked with grey. He sat at the defense table wearing a cheap grey prison suit, looking nothing like the untouchable billionaire who had demanded tears for amusement. Oliver Trent had flipped on him instantly. Facing disbarment and federal racketeering charges, the sleazy lawyer negotiated a plea deal by handing over the encrypted hard drives from the hidden servers. The evidence was insurmountable. Oliver testified for 3 grueling days, detailing how Dakota had systematically ordered the destruction of documents relating to the fatal crash and authorized the bribery of local law enforcement. But the final nail in the coffin was delivered on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The prosecution called their star witness. Madeline Hayes walked into the courtroom, her posture perfectly straight, her expression unreadable. She took the stand, swore an oath to tell the truth, and methodically walked the jury through the events of that fateful night on Montauk Highway. She played the audio recording. The harrowing sound of Josephine begging for help, echoing through the silent courtroom, made several jurors weep openly. When the defense attorney, a desperate public defender, assigned to the case after private legal teams abandoned Dakota due to unpaid bills attempted to loudly question her, Madeline systematically dismantled every question. She remained cool, clinical, and completely unshakable. She was not a victim seeking pity. She was an executioner, delivering the final blow. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson read the verdict guilty on all counts, including first-degree homicide, wire fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice, Dakota did not react. His soul had already been hollowed out. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corporate malfeasance, did not mince words during sentencing. She stared down from the bench. Dakota Harrington, you have operated under the delusion that wealth provides immunity from the basic laws of human decency. You murdered a pregnant woman to protect a lie, and you mocked the suffering of others for sport. The court sentences you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 150 years to be served consecutively. The gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. As the bailiffs moved in to escort him away, Dakota turned around, his desperate eyes searching the gallery. He found Madeline sitting in the second row. She was not smiling. She was not gloating. She simply offered a slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement that the debt had finally been paid. The game was over. Years later, the legend of the tear became a cautionary tale, whispered in the hallowed halls of high finance. Harrington Capital was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to the countless families Dakota had ruined. Madeline Hayes vanished from the public eye. She did not write a book. She did not give television interviews. She returned to a quiet, unassuming life, finding solace in the fact that her sister finally received justice. On the 10th-year anniversary of the crash, Madeline stood alone on the edge of Montauk Highway. The rain was falling softly, washing the pavement clean. She held the dented silver lighter in her hand. The engraving was still visible, but the menace behind the words had been entirely erased. She stared out at the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean, taking a deep breath of the salty air. With a swift, powerful motion, she threw the lighter into the roaring waves, watching it sink into the unforgiving depths. The anchor of the past was finally severed. Josephine could rest, and Madeline, for the first time in a decade, could finally begin to live. During his first week at the Supermax prison that would serve as his tomb, Dakota experienced the true meaning of sensory deprivation. His cell measured precisely 7 by 12 feet, constructed entirely of poured concrete. There were no mahogany tables, no crystal decanters, no sycophants to laugh at his cruel jokes. There was only a narrow slit of a window angled upward, so that he could see nothing but a tiny patch of the grey Colorado sky. He spent his days pacing the microscopic floor plan, haunted by the echoes of his own arrogance. He remembered the night at the club, the taste of the expensive water, the smooth feel of the pen against the leather checkbook. He remembered the thrill of the challenge, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. He had thrown away a fortune just to prove he could not be broken. In doing so, he had carelessly handed the very weapon of his destruction directly to the architect of his demise. The darkness of the concrete cell pressed against him, incredibly heavy and absolute. There was no one left to bribe. There was no one left to fire. There was absolutely no one left to fear him. The disgraced billionaire wept uncontrollably in the dark, deeply mourning the massive empire he foolishly threw away, all for a single fateful, devastating little trick gone wrong. The darkness of the cell pressed against him, heavy and absolute. There was no one left to bribe. There was no one left to fire. There was no one left to fear him. The king of the Wellington Club was dead, replaced by prisoner 89421-054, and as the cold mountain wind howled violently against the exterior concrete walls of the prison, a second tear finally formed in Dakota's eye. Then a third. Soon the billionaire who claimed he could never be broken was weeping uncontrollably in the dark, mourning the empire he threw away for the price of a single fateful tear.